So it's this futuristic dystopian world, but there's like vampires and fairies, and there's an LGBTQ romance, and it's really, really dark, but there's a happily ever after because there is a romance. And I don't know what I should classify that as. I really think it should have its own genre.
Welcome to Not Safe for Words. I'm your host, Crystal L. Kirkham, multi-genre author, editor, and cover designer. I'm here to give you insight into the world of publishing and to help you avoid the mistakes that others have made. So stick around, you're in for one hell of a ride where I don't curb the curses.
Okay, so I'm not going into this episode to be the be-all, end-all of how you figure out what your genre is for your novel. I'm just here to give you a few guidelines to try and make it easier, because this is a topic that seems like it should be really fucking straightforward, and somehow it's not. Somehow, so many of us have a lot of trouble figuring out exactly what our fucking genre is. I'm one of those people. Because I tend to write my books with no genre in mind. I write a story. I write a story I want to read. And hopefully others might want to read it too. And then I determine after the fact what the genre is. Now, knowing your genre isn't just important for your querying process to try and find a home for it. Or to figure out where you want to put your novel in when you self-publish as far as categories go. You also need to know what it is for marketing purposes. If you get it wrong, you're probably going to end up marketing your book to people who are going to fucking hate it because it is not what they expected. And this is something I've seen time and time again, where the expectations for a book, sometimes just solely based on genre, leave the reader wanting because it doesn't fit the genre in the way that it should. It's not that maybe that genre isn't a part of it. It's that the overall broad strokes of the plot are not that genre. And when you say one thing to your readers and they expect a certain thing out of you, and that's not what they get, they're not going to be happy. So you really need to know this shit. And you're probably never going to quite get it perfect. No, none of us will. It's not an easy topic, even though it should be. So we're going to go over a few broad strokes here. And that's the biggest thing you want to look at with your story. The broad strokes of the plot. Sometimes your main genre is simply determined by where you set your story. And sometimes it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So we're just going to touch on the bare basics. And hopefully this gives you a jumping off point so that you know what you're looking at when you're trying to figure it out in the future, or, you know, once you're done listening to me babble on about fucking genres. Now, I can't stress this enough. As I go through talking to you about this, we are only focusing on the main plot. Don't think about your subplots. Leave those alone. Those are a part of your subgenres. And that's not quite as important as getting the main one right. Because once you have that right, then you can start narrowing it down further. All right. So let's talk about a few of the big main ones. And once again, this is not a complete list. All right? If somebody says, hey, you forgot this genre, that genre, you forgot to go through each and every one of the different type of punk genres. That's not what I'm doing here. Broad brushstrokes, guys. Okay? So first of all, let's start with fantasy. Which is surprisingly, once again, very confusing for a lot of people. Fantasy encompasses a huge range of subgenres, way too many to even begin to list, but it can basically be summed up as any story where fantastical elements are an integral part of the main plot line. Fantastical elements can include mythical creatures, magic, fantasy realms, places that are not Earth, but not alien planets. And, of course, you're going to get a lot of other things in there. The term fantasy will pop up as not only as a primary genre, but also as a subgenre, and that's the fun part. But the key thing is those fantastical elements need to be critical to the plot line. Historical fiction is one of those that is more or less pretty straightforward. Those are stories based in the past. I love historical fiction. I read a lot of it. And most of the stuff I read is from our world history, but fictional. However, when you start writing things like alternate history, that's when you start straddling the lines between primary genres, and that becomes historical fantasy, because that is a historical story with fantastical elements. So it's actually more under the fantasy primary genre than the historical fiction genre, but in all honesty, it really does straddle the line. Horror is one, and I say this about every genre, it shouldn't be difficult, but it fucking is. Horror can have supernatural elements, such as ghosts, werewolves, vampires, angels, demons, whatever. But the goal of horror is to dredge up the fear and emotion of your reader. And if you aren't trying to scare the fuck out of your reader, you probably aren't writing horror. Simple as that. You can write all the supernatural and paranormal stories you want, but that really becomes more of a subgenre than a primary genre at that point. So then again, in that case, you want to look, what is the main goal of the plot line? If it ain't horror, your paranormal supernatural story falls under another primary category. Literary fiction, that one is very straightforward. It's actually not that confusing. It's probably one of the few ones on this list that isn't confusing, because literary fiction really grapples with the human condition and political criticism without having to wrap it up in some sort of fantasy or futuristic world. It just is. It's very introspective. It's very character driven, and not everybody's cup of tea. But I actually can quite enjoy it if it's in a short story format. Mainstream realistic fiction are two that can kind of be lumped together sometimes. And these tend to be your plot-driven story and can sometimes be confused with literary fiction, which is very character-driven. But once again, you're not seeing any fantastical or science fiction-y elements going on here. But they also tend to be stories that appeal to a wide general audience. All right, moving on. Mysteries, thrillers, and suspense. These are three that a lot of people get mixed up and kind of shoved together into the same category sometimes, but they are actually very distinct types of novels. So in the mystery, the reader doesn't know who did the crime until the end of the story. You're dropping clues along the way. That's what makes it a mystery. Who done it? Your basic things, your cozy mysteries, personal favorite of mine again. In thrillers, quite often the reader knows who committed the crime, so the focus of the story is less on the discovery of the criminal and more on the action and danger of catching the criminal and, trying to save the day at the end. And suspense is that wonderful part that kind of combines the two genres, where you have a building of danger and you don't know who done it, and you're not going to find out until the end, and it leaves you suspenseful on the edge of your seat. That's pretty much the big difference between those three genres. Mysteries are wonderful, so are thrillers and suspense. Suspense, though, often becomes more of a subgenre in a lot of things. So do keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, I'm not going to cover anything like nonfiction, but let's talk about romance, because romance is a huge genre that a lot of people actually still tend to get wrong, especially when they're using romance as a subgenre. And if the focus of your story is the development of a romantic relationship between characters, if that's what helps to drive the plot, and at the end of it all there is a happy ever after or a happy for now, That's a fucking romance. Whether it's a paranormal romance or erotic romance where you go a little bit deeper into those sex scenes, still a fucking romance. That's it. That's your big umbrella line right there. But if the relationship isn't an important part of the story, then that's definitely going to become a part of erotic fiction where the sex is what drives the story. And that makes the biggest difference between romance and erotica, is erotica focuses more on the acts than it does on the relationship. So that's your key difference there. And I've known a few people who have messed that up, and it's really affected their ability to market their book effectively, because those are sometimes overlapping readers groups, but not necessarily. Some people really want that romance, and some just want those steamy as fuck scenes, and not always overlapping. So important thing to remember, there is a strong distinct difference there. All right, so science fiction. Alien races, futuristic settings, time travel, space operas. There are so many subgenres under science fiction again, but if you have those elements, it doesn't matter what else is there. It's mostly science fiction with the caveat of science fantasy. And that is something that does exist. It's not one you see a lot of, and I really wish there was more out there, because frankly, the idea of bringing fantasy into a scientific, futuristic thing, I love it, personally. I love the creativity of it. So this is where you get fantastical elements with a base in science and technology or futuristicness, but it's not ever going to be on a total fantasy planet. It's not something that's... Alright, so I know there's a lot of things I haven't covered, but we're getting a little bit long here. I mean, we could go on and on into women's fiction, satire, parody, humor, all those fun things. But you get the picture. What you're looking at is the large brushstrokes of your plot, and what fits the large brushstrokes the best. Now, before I say goodbye to you guys for today, I also want to touch on something that is also very, very important, because it does make a very big difference. It's not genre, but it's age categories. And it could be its own topic, but once again, I really want to give you that good basis to make sure you're heading the right direction. So a lot of people do get things like children's fiction, young adult, and new adult a little bit mixed up sometimes. And new adult isn't a very... I want to say not very common, but it's not one that a lot of people know about, and there are actually quite a bit of books that fit into that category out there. But there's a lot of wiggle room for age categories, but you got to think about that children's fiction is books that are targeted for readers under the age of 12. That's your children's fiction. And young adult are going to be ages 13 to 18 years old generally. And with young adult, your MC is going to be in that age group as well. New adult, you're going to see about 19 to 25-year-olds, and they tend to be a lot of similar themes as young adult, but a little bit racier, a little bit more intense. I guess is that a good word for it? Maybe, maybe not. But those are going to be very important categorizations when it comes down to it as well. So do your research, start with your large brush strokes, then start narrowing it down. So if I'm going to go back to that random list of genres and subgenres and whatnot that I described at the beginning, what I would probably have would be paranormal romance, LGBTQ, and possible science fantasy as my overall umbrella. Now, since I don't know what story that is because it's not based on anything real, it could be more paranormal romance, it could be more of a science fantasy, or maybe it really is just fantasy. I don't know. I'd have to write it to find out. This has been another episode of Not Safe for Words. I hope you've found some useful advice here today. If so, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can join me next time for more publishing and writing insights. Thanks for listening.